Before we go any further, folks, you should know this week's episode is full of very big, very dark ideas, several of which focus on suicidal ideation. Please make sure your self-care shields are on full, and if that means you need to step away from this episode at any point, please know you do so with our blessing. Thank you. PsuedoPod, episode 757, May 14th, 2021. This week's story, Flash on the Borderlands 56, The Heart's Filthy Lesson. Hey folks, welcome to PsuedoPod, the weekly horror podcast. I'm Alistair, your host, and this week's subtitle references, entirely coincidentally by the way, one of my all-time favourite pieces of music. The Heart's Filthy Lesson is best known as playing over the end credits of Seven. It is industrial, atonal swagger, from first note to last. David Bowie's character, Detective Nathan Adler, it was a whole thing, a whole concept album, in the song, bemoaning the lack of relationship he has with tyrannical futurist Ramona Ace Stone. This leads to one of Bowie's, I would argue, finest lines. "Oh, Ramona, if there was only something between us, other than our clothes." And all in all, it's a song that makes my dark little goth parts sing. It's nasty and funny and too clever for its own good, overindulgent and operatic, and I love it. And it also, brilliantly, was briefly entirely about English landscape painters. More details in the show notes. Because The Heart's Filthy Lesson is manifold and present, and we have so much to learn, and so little time. And that brings us to The Woman the Spiders Loved by Corey Johnson. This first appeared in Penultimate Peanut and was reprinted in Corey's 2020 collection, I'll Tell You a Love Story. Corey is a graduate of the Northeastern Ohio Master of Fine Arts, currently attending the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Her short story collection, I'll Tell You a Love Story, is available through Bridge 8 Press. There will be more details in the show notes. Your reader for this is the incomparable Eliza Chan. Eliza is a writer and occasional narrator of specfic who has worked for us, Podcastle, and Cast of Wonders. It amuses her endlessly that people find her Scottish accent soothing. Eliza has had her own work featured in The Dark, Podcastle, Fantasy Magazine, and the Best of British Fantasy 2019. When not working on her current novel or reading, she can be found board gaming, watching anime, baby wrangling, and dabbling in crafts. You can find more out about her at her website or on Twitter. Both links will be in the show notes. So, the spiders have a story for you. And for better or worse, that story is true.
The Woman the Spiders Loved by Corey Johnson. Narrated by Eliza Chan. There was a woman who the spiders fell in love with. You knew her in high school, but you weren't friends. She was plainish. She still is. But that didn't matter to the spiders. They thought she was beautiful. It was something about her hair. It's long. She's never cut it, and it's very blonde. A spider saw her waiting for the bus one day, and it fell in love just as it was laying its eggs. When its young hatched and ate their mother's corpse, they also ate that love. They lived in her house under her bed. When she slept, they would slink out from underneath and do small things to let her know how much they loved her. No, they didn't write messages in webs. This is not a children's story. They didn't lay eggs in her skin either, so don't ask. They kissed her. With their little pincers, they nipped her skin inch after inch. She woke up itching every morning, covered in small, angry welts. Her skin was always speckled with tight black scabs from where she scratched the bites open with her nails. When the scabs fell off, the spiders collected them. They tied them up in their silk ropes and hung them like chandeliers from the underside of her bed. They went on biting, and she went on scratching. The spiders weren't poisonous enough to kill her, but each night she got a little more numb, until she could hardly feel anything at all. One day she called the exterminator, and the house was filled with gas. The spiders all died. She swept the remains out from under her bed, along with the small altars they had built from her skin. After that, no one ever loved her like the spiders did. In fact, no one ever loved her at all. She went on not feeling, and the spiders went on not living. That's just the way it is with love sometimes, I guess.
Like the man says, love is love is love is love is love. And sometimes we have to accept that love being unrequited completes it, just in a different way. We still bleed, of course we do, when do we not? But at least this way we know eventually it will stop. As Raymond Reddington once put it about grief, it will be the first thing you think of every morning. Until one morning, it will be the second thing. And that brings us to our second story, Edge of the Cliff by Dorothy Quick. Your reader for this story is Amanda Cheng, who loads trucks for a large package handling company in Pittsburgh. Her work is out of print, but her story continues. So without further ado, second story, second truth.
Edge of the Cliff by Dorothy Quick, narrated by Amanda Cheng. The girl sat on the edge of a cliff and gazed down at the jagged rocks below her, watching the water beat relentlessly upon them. The last rose tints of the sunset gave the eddying waters a translucent loveliness, but she shuddered as she looked at them. She couldn't see the beauty, only that the rocks and water were terribly far away. "I haven't the courage," she half whispered, her voice lost in the rushing waters. For a long while she sat quite still, staring blankly before her. From somewhere in the distance came the shriek of a whistle. Automatically the girl raised her head, listened, and laughed, a laugh that had no mirth in it. Her thoughts, which had been a formless confusion, suddenly focused. The factory whistle. Jim will be home soon. How he'll rave when he doesn't find me. If I went back he'd beat me, but I won't go. Dear God, help me to be brave. With the force of her prayer, she clasped her hands and moved convulsively. As she did so, her pump slipped off and went down into the dimness. She strained her eyes to watch, but she could discern nothing in the darkness, so she listened, every nerve tense. But she heard nothing, only the swishing snarl of the water beating on the rocks. Her slipper had gone. Soon she would follow. She dully wondered if it would hurt. She saw herself lying crushed and mangled, perhaps not dead, and began to shake. Unsteadily she got to her feet. She was going away from the terror of the cliff, back to Jim. It would be horrible, but at least she knew what it was like. If I were only brave, she thought, I wouldn't go back. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed hopelessly. All at once she was conscious of someone near. She took her hands away to look. There was a stranger standing beside her. "What's the matter?" he asked softly. There was no light, and she could not see his face, but something in his voice swept her terror away. Without an instant's hesitation, she began, "I want to die." She pointed downward. "But I haven't the courage." "Perhaps I can help you." There was a deep understanding in his tones. "But first, you must tell me why." Strangely, she didn't wonder that he made no attempt to preach or dissuade her from her project. Her soul went out to the sympathy and understanding she sensed in him. Her words came tumbling out jerkily, one sentence after another. "I loved Bob. My family married me to Jim. Jim had money, a house. I was pretty and could cook. Jim didn't love me, but I was useful. I hated him." She clenched her hands until the nails digging into the soft flesh brought drops of blood to the surface. "Yes?" questioned the stranger. "So—" monosyllables which left a gap to be filled. She went on. "I tried hard to like Jim. I couldn't. He was a drunken beast. Bob kept on being sweet to me, brought me little things when Jim wasn't there. Once he found me crying, saw my arms all black and blue, and then he took me in his arms." She paused a second to savor fully the joys of the remembrance. "We decided to go away together when Bob got enough money." The thread of her memory continued to unwind. Jim came home early. I hid Bob, but Jim was drunk. He began beating me. I tried to be brave, but God must have been asleep that night. I cried out. Bob came to help me, and Jim killed him." The stranger was silent. She continued, "Jim got off. He was a wronged husband. The jury was on his side. It was worse than ever for me when he came back. I can't stand it anymore. I want to go to Bob, only I'm not brave enough." The stranger moved a little nearer. "It only takes a minute," he whispered, but in his low tones there was a vibrancy. "1 second, and it is over." Her slight figure swayed. "I can't," she gasped. The stranger took another step. "You won't be alone. I will go too," he said slowly. "But why?" she began, then suddenly reached her hand out toward him. He ignored that and took a step toward the edge of the cliff. "Come." She moved forward. All at once she was aware of the sound of the water striking the rocks below, those sharp, jagged rocks. She shrank back. "I'm afraid." "Then return to him." He flung the words at her. "No, no!" cried the girl. "You must choose between Jim and Bob," he said sternly, then added, "Once you did not take so long to decide." "Bob might not find me," she sobbed. "It only takes a second," he pleaded, "and then there is eternity." The girl shivered again. "It is very dark." "At the bottom there is light." "It will be very cold." The stranger smiled. "My arms will be warm." "Come," he said softly, and this time held out his hand. The girl tried to grasp it, but he was going down, down into the blackness. There was a strange, luminous light about him. It didn't look quite so dark. The girl suddenly found courage. "Wait!" she cried. "I am coming!" From below, the stranger was smiling at her with Bob's smile, and his arms were outstretched. He wasn't a stranger anymore. He was Bob. Without 1 second's hesitation, she flung herself into his arms. They went down and down toward the bottom. Bob's lips were warm on hers. She did not even know when the waters enveloped her completely.
We have notes here from 2 staff members, both of whom make excellent points about this piece. The first is from M.M. Schill. "The reason I love this is I'm an obsessive fan of classical kabuki, and this story was reminiscent of a genre of kabuki called love and suicide play. The name describes exactly what the stories are about. There was that same forlorn, hyper-romance, hyper-edgelord feel that you get from an old love and suicide play, even down to the protag being known only as the girl. The purpose in excluding her name is to foreshadow her suicide, to diminish her like she's passing through the story, her life is shrinking away as her emotions and despair and forlorn feelings increase." We also have a note here from editor Alex Hofelek. "What does it say about 1941 if agency hadn't advanced past women being nameless possessions? There's a lot of evocative language used to convey her status as property, given away as part of a marital bargain, a husband being given the default belief in court, and so on. All of these beliefs are deliberate choices. This is an early example of feminist specfic, dealing directly with an issue that was normalized or ignored. How many films or TV shows, even decades later, show a woman just needing a good slapping to bring her to her senses? This story is fine on its own, but all the more powerful when set in historical context. It is worth noting that when this was published, Dorothy Quick, along with every other woman in the US, had only been allowed to participate in at most 6 presidential election cycles. And now, almost 80 years after publication, we've finally had a woman make it to the position of vice president. Here's what I had to say about it. At the bottom there is light. That's a line. And it's true as well. Saying anything else would be to undersell the attraction of moments like this. Moments, by the way, that do not necessarily need a physical cliff edge. This is the deep breath before the plunge. This is the moment before everything changes. The 21st century, like the man says, is where it all begins. And if we're not ready, and do you feel ready, then what do? We take the last step we'll ever take, and we trust and hope that maybe this time the light at the bottom isn't the rest of the anglerfish. It's always the anglerfish. Don't take the step. However much you want to. In fact, the more you want to, the less you should. At least this time. After all, isn't it better to regret not doing something and to know to do it again than have nothing but light and warmth and oblivion? and the slower recession of the world. Or worse, to be trapped inside that last moment without even the luxury of release. And that idea, stuck in a moment, that brings us to The Memory of Love by Peter Adam Salomon. Peter Adam Salomon's second and third novels, All These Broken Angels and 8 minutes 32 seconds, were nominated for the Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement in YA Fiction. His first 2 novels were named A Book All Young Georgians Should Read by the Georgian Centre for the Book. What a lovely idea. He's founded both National Dark Poetry Day, October 7th, and the annual International Horror Poetry Showcase with the HWA. His poem, Electricity and Language and Me, was performed by the Radiophonic Workshop on BBC Radio 6, and 2 of his poetry collections were nominated for the Elgin Award. Psalm, his poem, was nominated for the Dwarf Star by the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association, and in addition, he was the editor of the first books of poetry released by the HWA, Horror Poetry Showcase Volumes 1 and 2. He's a member of the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, the HWA, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, the SF Poetry Association, the International Thriller Writers, and the Authors Guild. Your reader for this story is the incomparable Dave Thompson, long-term escape artist veteran, magnificent editor, educator, dad, friend, and all-around superhero. You know you are in good hands with Mr. Thompson, and trust me, good hands is absolutely where you are. Now, time for another true story, an uncomfortably true one, some would say.
The Memory of Love by Peter Adam Salomon. It snowed the day she came back into my life, a late fall storm that blanketed red and gold leaves with white sugar icing. It had been humid and gray the day they'd buried her. Today, as snow fell upon a sea of maple, her voice whispered against me. The heat began in my heart and shot outwards, bleeding off my fingers as memories called to me, my name on her lips. Outside, the storm continued, but I couldn't see through where my breath had fogged the window. When I turned around, she was perched on the edge of the bed, waiting for me to join her. Blonde hair curled over her shoulders. Blue eyes stared through me, drawing me in. When she reached for me, I fell to my knees in front of her, pulling her against me. The exquisite feel of her burned through me. I had forgotten how soft skin could be, how sweet the breath shared in that first kiss, how wonderful she was, how alive and beautiful and mine. She was gone when I awoke, though her scent lingered, as it always had. That first kiss still wet my lips. I dragged myself away, refusing to look behind me to see the empty bed. I couldn't help myself. I never could. I looked. She was perched on the edge of the bed, waiting, once again, for me to join her. There was nothing else but her smiling at me. With each step I took towards her, that glorious smile grew. She was waiting, willing. Oh, so willing. Blue eyes pierced me to the core as her memory called my name. Soft, sweet, beautiful, wonderful. I had never stopped missing her. Not when I buried her. Not in all the days since. There was a vast emptiness within where she had been. I missed her. Still, I missed her always. I remembered watching her die, holding her in my arms as she drew that last precious breath before she left me, alone, forever alone. Now it was snowing once more. I held her in my arms. She kissed away each tear that slid down my cheek, banishing the nightmare that had been her death, promising me that I'd never be alone again, that she'd fill the void I'd lived with for so very long. With her whisper-sweet voice, she invited me to join her, to never miss her again, to never be alone, to be with her forever, always. That she finally wanted me as much as I had always wanted her. She was there, waiting for me. After all these years, living through the nightmare of my life without her, she'd finally forgiven me for killing her, and all I had to do was die.
No one on Earth lives without regret. No one on Earth is not visited in the small hours from time to time by old friends with knives for memories, ready to warm themselves against the flush of our shame. Our regrets are our Greek chorus, always observing, always watching, and on the occasions when we are very lucky, perhaps steering us away from making them again. This individual has no manner of luck at all, nor does he deserve it. This is one of the most nuanced Flash pieces I've seen in a long time, because Peter manages to not only bring forth a modicum of sympathy, but also not to shy away from the awful thing the lead has done. This is hell, nor is he out of it, eternally living in the moment after the light fades from someone else's eyes by his hands, and the worst part of your life is launched by the final part of theirs. He's pitiable, a self-broken man made into something lower by his own idiocy. But he isn't dead. And sympathy must be tempered by continuation of the searing fury of watching someone be arrogant enough to think that they have control over someone else's story and when it should end. No one does. No one should. Never let someone have that. Which brings us to our final piece for the week. 3 years ago this May by Trace Conger. This story first appeared in Shock Totem, issue 10, March 2016. And your reader for this is Lisa Hicks. After training at the drama studio in London, Lisa went on to perform in children's theatre in the UK, then became an international school librarian in Belgium, where she now teaches theatre studies. When not teaching, dancing on a rating, you can find her on long walks, buds firmly in ears, listening to an audiobook. Sounds cool. Without further ado, then, one more time, one more true story.
"3 Years Ago This May" by Trace Conger, narrated by Lisa Hicks. Henry wants to die today. He doesn't think I know what's going on in that head of his, but I do. 43 years of marriage and raising 3 children together will do that to you. I've been able to read his mind for as long as I can remember. Can finish his sentences most of the time, too. Every morning at our summer cabin had been the same since we retired and bought the place 8 years ago. Henry gets up at the crack of dawn, downs a cup of the blackest coffee he can brew, kisses me good morning, and then sets out on his canoe trip across the lake and back. It takes him about an hour. If he stops on the lake to feed the ducks, it's an hour and 15. We've got 2 canoes tied to the dock. The scratched to Hades aluminum one came with the place. One of the seats is broken, and it's prone to tip with the slightest shift in weight. The other, a green fiberglass canoe, came courtesy of the Adirondack Conservation Society raffle 2 years ago. It's got padded seats and doesn't bounce as much on the water. I used to have my own morning ritual. After watering down his brew, I'd sit on the back porch in my thatched rocking chair and flip through a stack of Adirondack Life magazines we'd collected over the years. I'd look up every few minutes to see how much progress Henry had made on the lake. After 2 cups of coffee, I'd head for the kitchen, fire up the stove, and watch him from the kitchen window. When Henry returned, we'd enjoy breakfast, and then talk about what we were going to do for the rest of the day. Maybe head into town, visit with friends, read in front of the fire, or just sit around and do nothing. Same routine, every morning, every summer. Sometimes Henry sits on the back porch and knocks squirrels out of the pine trees with his .22. He keeps the handgun in a black and yellow plastic toolbox next to the back door. I don't like the killing, but squirrels can make a mess of the place in the off-season. They get inside the cabin and settle into the mattresses. They rip up the furniture and scratch the walls. One year, they even chewed through an electrical cord. We arrived that June to find 2 fried squirrels on the kitchen floor. I stay inside when Henry shoots. Sometimes I instinctively cover my ears when I hear the pop. The 22 doesn't make a loud bang. It sounds more like a small firecracker than a gunshot. But it's unnerving nonetheless. It doesn't have a lot of stopping power, but it gets the job done. Our morning routine changed after Henry's accident. It was 3 years ago this May. Some college kid fell asleep at the wheel and collided with Henry's Chevy pickup truck on I-70. The kid lost a few teeth and his football scholarship. Henry lost both his legs, severed just above the knees. Ever since the accident, Henry has been different. He's the funniest man I know, but I can't remember the last time I saw him laugh. It doesn't help that our children are grown and scattered across the country. Chris in Chicago, Adam in Los Angeles, and Jessica in Minneapolis. They're on their own now and don't have as much time to visit. They don't need us like they used to when they were younger. Sometimes it feels like we're floating out here on our own. Henry is always eager to get to the cabin come June. He loves the water. But I think it's the absence of other people that really calls him here. There's no one else around to ask if he needs help or if there's anything they can do for him. In the privacy of our cabin, he still has his legs. The main parts of our morning routine are still there, and the differences are subtle. He doesn't think I notice them, but I do. He still brews his coffee as black as the lake bottom, and I still water it down. He still kisses me good morning, but he kisses me longer than he used to, and he's never the first to let go. Now he rolls down the worn dirt path, being careful not to catch his wheelchair on the exposed tree roots, overgrown ferns, or wild huckleberries. I suggested installing a ramp down to the dock. Insurance would cover it, but Henry said it was out of the question. He said he didn't want to muck up the natural surroundings with a corrugated metal monstrosity. I told him we could get one made out of pine to match the back porch, but the wave of his hand told me I shouldn't bring it up again. Once he makes it to the dock, he maneuvers his wheelchair around the grooves in the planks. He locks the brakes, lowers himself down onto the dock from the wheelchair, and then crawls into the aluminum canoe, bobbing in the gentle morning ripples. His red and green checkered flannel blanket is tied tight around his waist. He says he wears it to keep warm, but I know he's really trying to protect me from seeing something he doesn't think I want to see. It never bothered me, though. He tosses the faded orange life jacket out of the canoe and onto the dock, unties the line, and paddles out. He no longer goes all the way to the other side of the lake. Instead, he paddles a few 100 yards out to the deepest part and sits there. Every morning he seems to stay out a little longer, thinking. Henry doesn't know it, but I watch his ritual through the binoculars from the porch. He sets the oar inside the canoe, grips the sides with his hands, leans forward, and waits, convincing himself of something. That's the moment he makes his decision, whether to overturn the canoe or not. I think that's why he takes the aluminum canoe. Like I said, it's prone to tip, and maybe one morning the lake will make his decision for him. Sometimes he turns and stares toward the back porch, sometimes not, but so far, every morning, he's lowered himself back into the cracked seat, slipped the oar back into the water, turned the canoe around, and paddled back to the dock. Then we make breakfast together. Of course, my morning routine has changed too. I still water down his brew, and I still sit in my thatched rocking chair on the back porch. I no longer thumb through my magazines, and I don't start on breakfast while he's on the lake. Instead, I watch him through the binoculars. I watch him paddle back to the dock. Once he arrives safe and sound, I take the 22 out of my mouth and place it back inside the plastic toolbox. And sometimes I even have a third cup of coffee.
We have a note here from the author. 3 years ago this May was my attempt to write a short story with a strong finish. Both Jack Ketchum's The Box and Edwin Arlington Robinson's poem Richard Cory inspired the tale. The question at the centre of it all is, how do we go on without the ones we love? No one on earth lives without regret. No one lives without grief. We engage with that grief in a million different ways, but for me, at times, it has been tied very strongly to addiction. Grief and guilt are warm, dark pools it is so easy to dive into, to drink deep from. It is horrible, it is relentless, it reminds you of what you've lost, and surely that honours what you've lost, keeping the good wound open, even when everyone else is telling you to finally let it close. Surely there is no better use of your time. There is nothing but better uses for your time. Love is love, like the man says. Love is support and assistance and bad jokes and being there when the other person is too tired to move, or when you've hit decision fatigue and don't know what to do or how to do it. Could love be suicide? Yes. But only once. And what would be the point in that? You want, you deserve, you need so much more than a single moment of ill-considered, homicidal solidarity. We all do, and that is the core of the Heart's Filthy lesson, the single thing that shines cleanly and brightly at its centre, the beat that undercuts every horrific self-destructive impulse we have, the hunger that drives us all into the gap between this beat and the next. We could all live there if we need to. If you need to, please do. But none of us have to stay there, and when you're ready, when you realise that, we'll be there when you come back out. Thanks to all our readers and authors for some dark, very powerful, very good stories this week. Difficult, complex, thorny, and outstanding stuff. We're now paying associate editors, who are slush readers, and the first line of contact for every magazine and author. They are the unsung heroes of the industry, and it's time to sing them. We're currently paying all 4 shows associate editors at a reduced rate, because we aren't quite at the target donations yet, but it was time to get this done. So, we still need your help, especially as in addition you pay for literally everything else, stories, staff, you name it, so thank you. And if you can, please either donate money or time. Please do so. For time, it's easy. Did you like this story? Then talk about it on social media. Leave a review. Anything like that helps like you would not believe. Money is literally the only thing that helps more. For $5 you can subscribe and get endless amounts of audio goodies either at Patreon or through PayPal. And if you have Amazon Prime, with 5 minutes you could support us with $5 a month for free. Go to escapeartists.net/Twitch and we'll walk you through it. It's a little fiddly, but it's worth it. We'll be back next week with Little Worm by Genevieve Flynn, read by E.R. Jang, and audio produced once again by the amazing Chelsea. Then, as now, will be a production of Escape Artists Incorporated and released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. And we leave you with, in a sense, the only quote we could leave you from. Ernest Hemingway, by way of Seven. The world is a fine place, and worth fighting for. And unlike Detective Somerset, I believe both parts. See you next time, everybody.
It's a PsuedoPod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.